So, all right, we're officially recording, so I'll have to stop swearing at you now. All right, some things from, I haven't finished grading, but I'll finish yours today. For whatever reason, I grade the other two classes first. It's not a mystery. They're both 1301, so they're the same. So I grade yours after I'm done with theirs. So I'll have yours graded by the end of the day, which could be late. I'm not gonna lie, I got a million things to do since I was out of town. But some things to think about. All right, thing number one, details always matter. Always, always, always. So you want specific examples in your answers. You have to do that. You have to. Okay, so don't just say like people were racist or things became more equal or there were some good laws passed during this time period. Be sure and tell me what those good laws were or some evidence that people were racist or, whatever. We talk about this every week. There's a reason I keep saying this every week because many of you still aren't doing it. Thing number two, and I say this to you a lot, but you're still not doing it, so I'm going to say it again. When you write about events, write about them in order, because if you write about the last thing and stick it at the beginning and the first thing and stick it at the end, it doesn't show change over time, chronology, the kind of things that really matter in a history class. Because, well, like the last question about changes in civil rights, I had somebody talk about, I think they started off with Brown versus Board of Education, then they mentioned World War II, and then they mentioned Plessy, and then at the end they mentioned desegregation of the military by Truman, and then Little Rock Nine, and it's all in just some weird order. The order in which things happen should be the order that you discuss the things in, because it's a history class. What happens leads to something else, or at least it shows the events in the order that they occurred. So that really, really matters. It really matters. Yeah. Yeah, and we want it to make more sense. And here's another thing. I feel like I tell you these things every week because I do, but still you're not doing these things in your answer. So this tells me one of two or three things. Possibility number one, you log on and don't pay attention. That would shock me if that were the case, but I think that might be it. Thing number two, I think because of a couple of your responses in previous sessions, this could be possible too. You just don't care. It's like, I don't care what she says. I'm going to answer these however I feel. This is fine as well. This is fine as well. Okay. However, I do grade your paper. So if I'm telling you, this is how I'd like something done, this is what I would like to see in your answer, you may think I'm wrong, but I'm giving you the grade. Okay. So if I'm asking you to do something, there's probably a reason. Now, this chronological order thing, that is standard history professor thing. You're not going to have any single history professor that says, I really prefer if you discuss stuff out of order. Order is our thing, shows cause and effect. We like that kind of stuff. I don't know that I have a third reason you might not do it. I just think you're not paying attention. Also, here's the other thing. Textbook, I assigned you that textbook for a reason. I don't earn any money from assigning you a textbook. I know some of you are like, it's so much easier just to Google it. Sure, it is, no doubt. But you don't know who wrote the articles that you just Googled. We do know who wrote the textbook, and that guy's a darn good historian. Fred, who writes on the internet, may not be as good a historian as Eric Foner from Columbia University. Just a thought. So, validity of the source matters a lot. Chronology matters a lot in a history class. So you'll have other history classes I won't be the only history professor that suggests that these two things matter. Validity of the source, which is why we like textbooks rather than Wikipedia or whatever the heck else comes up first on Google, and chronology. We like those things, okay? All right, I feel like that part of the lecture is over. So, all right, so. Oh, okay, I'm looking at your chat. Just trust me on this stuff. Now, I also get if you put something a little out of order in the intro or the conclusion, that's not going to bother me. But if your whole answer's out of order, it's just weird. All right. Yeah, that's probably not going to be the comment I put. Also, a couple of you are like, I don't even know why you think I'm behind or what I'm doing wrong. How can I improve my answers? Okay. Here's how you know what your grades are. Look in the gradebook section of Blackboard. Just click on it. Yeah, the same place that you get, I mean, that same program where you get the assignments, that's where you can get your grades as well. And if you click on the rubric part of your grade, I'm pretty sure the comments show up. I promise you, I don't give you a grade without putting a comment in. Even those of you that turn stuff in a month and a half late, you still got a comment other than this is a month and a half late, okay? So please look at the comments because I write those comments because I'd like for you to improve your answers so that you can get what you like, which is a better grade. All right. I feel like we're done with this. Okay. Let's see if I can find the weekly question. Weekly question. Hopefully I put up the ones where I don't write comments. Okay, this will be a fun one. During the 1960s, the United States had become a more open, more tolerant, in a word, freer country. Defend or refute this statement. Prove me wrong with the meme. Okay. And on this one, of course, you can both defend and refute the statement. I would strongly suggest, here I'm strongly suggesting something about the weekly question, so perk up a little bit here. Oh, also, those of you that don't pay attention in class, I know you're not paying attention now, but if you ever go back and look at the video when I put up on the screen the weekly question, that's usually when I'm talking about the weekly question. So you could always go back and just review that section. That would be fun, wouldn't it? Okay, so during the 60s, here's my plan for you. Intro that just kind of talks about generally what's going on in the 50s, which is an increase in prosperity and improvement in civil rights. Then maybe a paragraph about how things got better, more open, more tolerant. Then maybe a paragraph about how things really didn't improve at all, so how things still remained intolerant and closed, and then maybe a little conclusion. Okay, just a thought. Also, another thought, since you have one question a week, when your answer is shorter than the question, there's no way I'm going to give you a passing grade. You've got to write more. You do. And if you use some of those cool online sources, can we not just copy and paste them? All right, but this one, as far as the chapter, honestly, any part of the chapter is going to help you on this. So you'll have to decide what it is specifically you want to talk about. However, you definitely need to add some specific detail because the entire chapter really is specific detail about this question. I know that you're not going to write about everything. I know that you're not. So, but if you write about several specific things, I'm going to be completely fine with it. Okay. All right. All right. Also, let's see. I noticed it's probably not helpful now, but on the notes, sometimes I give you some little hints about things you might want to put in there. This week's chapter about the 60s is probably helpful. You noticed last week, like your weekly question, and then I put the hints on there. Oh, I forgot. Let's put the, do we want to put the weekly question on here? Maybe. And maybe that wasn't, maybe I didn't save that in your version, but you can screenshot it, you know, if we do this. But I think we'll probably talk more specifically about the weekly question next time, even though entire chapter works for a weekly question. All right, here we go. It's 1960s. Okay, I think you have an impression of the 1960s because most people do, where everybody's running around in tie-dye and using as many drugs as possible and having sex with everyone they meet. My impression of the 60s is that it's not exactly like that. Here's why I have an impression of the 60s, aside from being a US history teacher. Thing number one, I was born in, yes, the 60s. Now, I was born toward the end of the 60s, kind of, sort of, 1966. So my memory of the 60s, not that profound. I remember lunar landing, a couple of things, mostly my grandparents. That's about what I remember. But I did know a lot of people who lived a lot of their adult lives in the 60s, like my parents, all my uncles who served in Vietnam or avoided serving in Vietnam, depending on which side of the family, and my parents. And what I noticed about most of them is they were fairly conservative. And the country was as well until the end of the 60s. And that's when you start to see more of the protests against the war and the tie-dye and the drug use and the having sex with everyone you meet, but only really at Woodstock. More of that kind of cultural craziness that you imagine is a little more a factor of the 70s than the 60s. The 60s starts out incredibly conservative. You'll notice this because if you look at statistics, that sort of about public opinion, almost everybody very much in favor of entering the Vietnam conflict, of stopping the spread of communism. You'll notice that your presidents are really in several ways kind of conservative, at least with foreign policy really conservative. And that's going to be maybe the juxtaposition in the answer to your question, is you've got domestic policy and foreign policy. The foreign policy is going to remain really conservative until the guy who kind of liberals it up a little bit, oddly enough, is Richard Nixon. You're going to go like, that doesn't make sense. I know it doesn't make sense, but it's true. The domestic policy is probably going to be a little more liberal because you're going to see an advance in civil rights. You're going to see a little bit with JFK, but quite a bit with LBJ, which is also kind of ironic because if you're looking at those two guys and you're thinking, who's the more liberal, forward-thinking guy, my guess is you didn't pick LBJ. When I was up visiting, yes, my father for his 80th birthday, he's also slightly more conservative than me, which happens sometimes with the old people, but he's also slightly less conservative than my three brothers, which I always find fascinating. But anyway, my father's like, when you guys in Texas talk about LBJ, do you mention that he messed up the Vietnam conflict, or you just talk about how great he is with civil rights and pretend Vietnam didn't happen? I said, Dad, it's really hard as a historian to pretend Vietnam didn't happen. So juxtaposition, I mean, it's tricky stuff. You're going to notice not everything's great, not everything's terrible. It's usually mixed, but you notice on it. Okay, let's hit the notes. You ready? I didn't get the 3-minute warning yet, so we're in good shape. Civil rights revolution, emphasis on nonviolence and public awareness. And we've got a list of people who are a part of that nonviolent movement or the nonviolent philosophy. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, the live person who's leading, the biggest part of the movement. Southern Christian Leadership Conference, he's the chair of that off and on, along with, what is that, Reverend C.T., that's his, C.T. Vivian, and a couple other folks as well. And if you study the civil rights in more depth, which I really think you'd be fascinated by if you have time later on in your lives, what you'll notice too is there's a lot of conflict between, nonviolent conflict, of course, between national leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and other people at the head of the SCLC, and local leaders who think that these guys are kind of grandstanding, that they come and do events and then leave, and then they leave the local leaders to clean up the mess. And there's some truth to that. I mean, there just is, because that's kind of the way national movements with local components work. You'll also notice a pretty strong, a really strong conflict between guys like Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X that lead to Malcolm X not living for a very long life. So these national movements have local or internal conflicts as well, which make them also incredibly complex. So if you're looking at philosophy, Gandhi and Niebuhr, these guys are not alive during this time. It's gone at this point, yeah. But these guys really are founders of some of that nonviolent philosophy. Also Jesus, I'm aware. Niebuhr is a theologian who lived in Germany during the Nazi period, and he gets imprisoned and executed in a concentration camp because he resisted some of Hitler's plans and noted that they waited too late. When they came for me, no one was there to help me. Now, he resisted long before they came for him, which is why they came for him. All right, Bayard Rustin, we've talked about him 8 million times. African-American guy who led the nonviolent training in summers, openly gay fellow who and planned the March on Washington, the 1963 thing there, but couldn't be openly acknowledged as a leader in the movement because he's openly gay, which is not a thing. It's not cool, even in the 60s, which probably gives you something to talk about in the were the 60s really open and fair and free, because sexual, I don't know the right word to say because I really don't want to goof this up, but however you identified, if you didn't just identify as, I don't know that straight is even the right word, and I apologize, but if you didn't have a traditional marriage, even if you were single too long in this era, no, still not cool. Now, I know that there are things coming in the 60s that maybe start to open this, and I know that our textbook and other sources sometimes suggest that LGBTQ rights really start developing during this time period. I would suggest to you that the more impactful part of that movement comes in the 80s and 90s. Just a suggestion which you don't have to agree with. Okay, never have to agree with me, but I'll try to explain to you as we go through why I think that, which again, you don't have to agree with. All right, back to this. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee becomes a little impatient, and you'll see them start to lead more direct protest and more direct action, including sit-ins, and that's where they would go to restaurants that wouldn't serve people of color at the lunch counters, at the tables, and they would just sit down until they got arrested. And they, of course, never got served. They just got arrested. And if you're wondering why they got arrested, because we've already had Brown versus Board of Education, which essentially desegregates all public schools, hence probably facilities. And then the Supreme Court has already ruled that segregating public transportation is illegal. So the court's already ruled on this. The problem is, if you're wondering, are you wondering what's the problem if the court's already ruled? I bet you can guess. The federal government is not enforcing the law, right? And state governments may or may not. In the North, they are. In the South, they're not. And I'm sure you are shocked by that as well. So the Greensboro is, God, why can't I remember? North Carolina, I believe, but whether it's North or South, it's, it's still the South. So people got arrested for disturbing the peace. I don't think I finished that thought, my apologies. Congress of Racial Equality is going to help and work together with SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, to arrange these things. Also freedom rides, because transportation had already been desegregated, but if you rode a bus from the north to the south, and if you're wondering, why would I ride a bus from the north to the south? Because it was a cheap mode of transportation. People used to ride the bus all kinds of places to go travel. I have friends who still do ride the bus for 10 or 12 hours, but that's usually when they take trips to Mexico. I don't have as many friends that ride the bus in the like Greyhound or whatever the other bus is that I can't remember. All right, but they used to have bus lines the same way that you would have a train line, or maybe you'd ride the Amtrak, which isn't as much of a thing in Texas, or an airplane. Okay, so it's sort of the private version. It is a private version of transportation. But anyway, the interstate buses were still segregated. So these college kids would get on in the north and ride through the south, really just to see if they get harassed, and they did. And it was pretty common for the KKK to flatten the tires of the bus, set the bus on fire, beat up the people on the bus, to the point where they, toward the end of this movement, would have a state trooper or some sort of police or military person on the bus with them, at least to keep them from getting killed. It didn't keep them from getting hurt or their bus from getting attacked, but it did keep them from getting killed. All right, and I know I have links to these things. If you have time, this Time for Justice thing shows you the early part of the civil rights movement. It is an amazing film. Definitely worth 30 minutes of your time if you have it to spare, because it really outlines all of and shows you all of the major events up to the March on Washington and the Voting Rights Act. So the early part of the civil rights movement, really, really good. And I know some of you are probably more political than others. It's created by a group called Southern Poverty Law Center. And I know that they, some people really like them. Some people think they're terrible because they do declare certain groups and people hate groups. I'm telling you that this collection of clips is probably useful whether you like them or dislike them, but again, up to you. All right, freedom rides, protests in Birmingham led to Dr. King's arrest. This is after Rosa Parks. They called Birmingham Bombingham during this time period because the KKK bombed civil rights leaders' homes so often. And when Dr. King goes there and leads a protest, he gets arrested. And then he writes this letter in response to a letter from, it's either 10 or 12 religious leaders in Birmingham who said that he's really the reason they have problems in the city, because if he didn't come and cause all the trouble, their city would be peaceful, which is really a fascinating take on that. And Dr. King responds in a very famous letter, which talks about why they find it necessary to respond. And I think reading that might also be a little timely, in the wake of current events as well. Again, just to look at a different perspective. So, okay. But again, I'm gonna recommend A Time for Justice, but again, 30 minutes, it's hard to know if you have time. The letter from the Birmingham jail is shorter. You've got time for that. All right, March on Washington in 1963 is when Dr. King delivers the I Have a Dream speech. I'm also going to suggest to you, I heard, oh goodness, some video clip of some current civil rights leader talk about, how Martin Luther King Jr. was called a communist all the time. And most people probably not after 63 until 68, his death. We don't talk about Dr. King historically. And I think that's probably the period where people make accusations about him being a communist for a couple of reasons. One, I'm not saying that they're valid, by the way. One, he's going to oppose US involvement in the Vietnam conflict in an era where US involvement was still pretty popular. Now, by 1968, it's going to become less popular, but that's probably not why he was assassinated, although we, of course, don't know for sure. When he was assassinated, he was leading a garbage workers, marching in a garbage workers strike. So it was not about Vietnam. Doesn't mean that the person who killed him wasn't upset about Vietnam. The indication typically is that guy was a little crazy and a lot racist, but James Earl Ray, who's different than James Earl Jones. I always have students who write that James Earl Jones killed Martin Luther King Jr. It's like, no, James Earl Jones does the Arby's commercials and he was Darth Vader. So no, completely different guy. And The Lion King, he was also in The Lion. Yeah. All right. Sorry, I was thirsty there. All right. The other reason that Martin Luther King Jr. is considered communist is because he does come out and really favor more programs that look like, maybe sound like socialism to people, more fair wages for people at the lower end of the income spectrum, like garbage workers and other people who do difficult work and are underpaid. Yeah. So, and you'll see more of those labor movements toward the end of the 60s as well. So when Dr. King favors those and opposes the Vietnam conflict, people go, dang, socialist, communist. And I know also, we'd mentioned before, anybody who criticized the United States might be seen that way. So I think super conservative, rural Southern people, I know, huge stereotype, sorry, kind of works, kind of not, mostly works. I would have seen him maybe as communist before, but there's more of a general discussion of that. And the civil rights person that got interviewed who said everyone said he was a communist, that's an exaggeration, of course, as well, which I guess we're all prone to a bit since I just maybe did one myself. All right, March on Washington 63, considered the high point of the early part of the movement, no doubt. Yeah, because lots of people join in, and if you look at the video or just some pictures of the march, you'll notice people from all sorts of backgrounds, northern, southern, old, young. I don't know how you notice northern or southern, but sometimes you can look at license plates and stuff like that, because not everybody marched or people drove, nearby. Famous people, not so famous people, religious people, not so religious people. So you see a really big variety of folks involved in this. And it's really a sign that the nonviolent part of the civil rights movement was truly mainstream at this point. And if you're wondering, why was the nonviolent part so important? So it could be truly mainstream. Most people, and you still see this now, are not so keen on a part of a civil rights movement that appears to be violent, maybe favors shooting at the police. The part of the Black Panther movement really did declare war on the police. In the modern era, you've got people who want to defund the police. It's not always interpreted the way perhaps it's intended, and it's certainly not always well accepted. And that was true during this era as well. And anytime you've got somebody destroying property, tearing down statues, that kind of stuff, you're always going to have a crowd of people or a group of people who think there are better ways to deal with that. Even if you want to remove a statue, there's probably a petition, go to the city council rather than just destroy it. But then there are other people like, it's been here 200 years. We don't do it this way. It's not going to happen. Plus, it's just a statue. So all sorts of different points of view. All right. 63 civil rights protests in more than 185 cities with unusual goals, getting arrested and making the evening news. Because it didn't matter how mainstream and nonviolent you were if no one saw it. So you had to be seen on the evening news, otherwise it doesn't make news and gain popularity and gain acceptance. So very little of this stuff was random. And whether you think that's good, bad, or indifferent, I think it's good that you recognize it. It's sort of like, it's not the same, of course, but sort of like the Harlem Renaissance wasn't very random, really. I mean, there were people who were doing contests and people who earned money doing this. I am not suggesting people earned money with the civil rights protests. I do not believe that they did in 63. But I do believe that they planned them around noon so that they could get footage to the 5 or 6 o'clock news. Because if no one sees it, it doesn't happen. You know what I mean? Leaders of the movement wanted to contrast their methods as well with the methods of those who opposed them. So they're nonviolently protesting, and they're getting the living crap beaten out of them on camera. So they really want you to notice that they are more Christian, more nonviolent, more proactive, productive than the people who oppose them. And they want to raise public awareness of how the South, not the South, but the leadership in the South, especially political and in some instances, lots of instances, law enforcement leadership really were racist. Yeah. And organizers wanted the average white person in the North to support them for a variety of reasons. One, the college age folks would come to the South and help out with the civil rights movement, which was sometimes helpful, sometimes not, for a variety of reasons. Two, more people in the North and those folks vote. So voting in people who are more in favor of civil rights reform going to happen more on a national scale if people in the North are in favor of it. You know, the deep, deep South that might be controlled by the KKK, or at least parts of it that are, it wouldn't matter how much this was on the news. It's not going to change who they vote for. But if you change who the president is and you change control of the Congress, you can change control of not only federal law, but who enforces federal law. Because at this point, I don't know if you noticed, but the Supreme Court is really on the side of the civil rights movement, starting with Brown versus Board of Education. The presidents are moving that way. Truman mostly was. Eisenhower, JFK would like to be, but he's chicken. We'll talk about that here in a minute. LBJ, he's in, even though he sounds like he's not in. And then with Nixon, you see kind of a movement back, not a complete movement back, but enough of a movement back to gain some votes in the South. I know you hate to be cynical, but, and I'm not saying that this was Nixon's idea. I would strongly suggest to you some people who ran the Republican Party saw this as an opportunity. All right, organizers, there we go. All right, let's talk about Kennedy for a second. All right, I'm gonna stop for just a second though to see if you have any questions and also take a drink of water. All right, you guys have any questions? I haven't seen you chatting. Maybe did I get off topic? Not too bad. Yeah, do you guys have any questions? Are you paying attention? Give me the thumbs up at least. Okay, thanks. All right, at least one of you is, I appreciate that. All right, I got a thumbs up, I'm happy, thank you. Oh, you guys found the thumbs. I know the thumb is on the bottom of your screen where it says reaction. I don't know what the other reactions are. I hope there's not a middle finger in there. Is there middle finger? I'm good. No, you get clapping, a thumbs up, a laughing cry, a wow. Looks like a little celebration. Oh, a heart. Thank you very much. All right. And you could raise your hand as well. They should not add the middle finger. Yeah, I shouldn't have even mentioned that, should I? No. All right. Thanks for all the thumbs up. I appreciate it. I was just feeling a little lonely there, wasn't I? All right, back to the notes. All right. Checking the chat to make sure. Yeah, you guys just want to add the middle finger. Cannot do that. All right, Kennedy. Kennedy gives the speech about why does Rice play the University of Texas every year? Because not because it's easy, but because it's hard. And somewhere in that speech, it's like, you know, we have to be more selfless in what we do. We're going to put a man on the moon, that kind of stuff. It's a nice speech. It really is. Except if you went to Rice, then you probably don't like it. Or if you're going to Rice, that's a fine university, by the way. All right, it's the Harvard of Texas, although the University of Texas would not like that. Neither would Angelo State, but we liked JFK for a variety of reasons. Now remember, closest election in US history when he ran against Nixon. Because we liked the experience that Nixon had, but there's something kind of promising and charming about Kennedy. He does look better, there's that. He's younger, not substantially younger, but he looks enough younger. It's like 8 or 10 years. You're going like, that's half my life. I know, I'm sorry. But, it's not like the difference in Biden and Trump, which is like a year and a half, or any other guy who's almost 80 that seems to be in charge of politics. How did that happen, by the way? But JFK is young looking. He's got a really attractive wife. I'm not saying that Mrs. Nixon was unattractive. She was athletic and attractive, I'm sure. But this is chick, Jacqueline Kennedy. I just called her a chick. I'm sorry. Mrs. Kennedy, Jacqueline Bouvier, 'cause she wasn't married to someone else yet. Kennedy um, spoke several languages, very cultured, really kind of looked like a model. I mean, this was kind of the it couple, and we referred to this era as Camelot because, we don't have a nice royal family, although we do have the Prince, what's his name, the little red-haired freckled dude, and Meghan Markle. So now we have some royalty here, which is cool, or doesn't matter. I don't know which. But these were our king and queen, as close as we were going to get. And they had the cute little kids, and the White House was an idyllic setting. So Camelot, there you go. Plus, he speaks pretty well. He's highly educated. We're all super excited. Except we're a little nervous because we don't think he has that much political experience, mostly because he didn't have, I'm sorry about that. Yeah. And King Arthur, oh, that's sad. King Arthur doesn't kill his son, but, King Arthur does, JFK doesn't, but one of his kids does. Yeah, they lose a child, a baby. Yeah, it's not good. All right, and then of course Kennedy gets killed, and then Kennedy's brother gets killed, and before that Kennedy's other brother got killed. Yeah, it's a lot of stuff. Well, yeah, okay. You could do you should read a book about the Kennedys. Yeah. Okay, back to business now. We were a little nervous about JFK because he didn't have a lot of political experience, although we did like that he was a World War II veteran. They got a Purple Heart completely legitimately. He also did a weird thing that most rich people don't do. He was from a very wealthy family. His older brother Joseph was supposed to be the first president from the family, but he dies in a plane crash in World War II. So he's a pilot and really heroic dude. JFK served on a PT boat that got cut in half by a Japanese sub. I think it was a sub that was surfacing. And he saved the lives of several people on that boat. So he legitimately earns Purple Heart, not because his dad used to be ambassador to England and donated $8 zillion to politicians, but legitimately, earned the Purple Heart. However, he used his political prestige and connection to get into the military. I don't know very many people that do that because he could not really pass the physical. He had some things wrong with his back. He had something called Addison's disease, which I don't know anything about, sorry. But these are things that would have disqualified him from military service. So he used his connections to get into the military, which is not usually what wealthy people do with their connections. So and the reason he did this too is to kind of overcome the family legacy of not being in the military. His dad had not only avoided military service in World War I, but wanted the United States to stay out of World War II as well. So he was seen as kind of a little weak on defense, the dad. So JFK and family wanted to improve that legacy, plus they had ambitions of one of them becoming president and then maybe all of them becoming president. And that doesn't work out just perfectly, although one of them did. Yeah. All right. So yeah, and so many of them get injured or killed in really tragic circumstances that makes you not want to be a Kennedy. But this one gets elected and almost immediately, because you get elected in 60, you take office in 61. He's got a foreign policy issue. Okay. So when JFK became president, he inherited a plan from the Eisenhower administration to try to overthrow Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro had taken over Cuba in a revolution in 1959 or 60, I think it was 59. And he had decided he was going to be a communist and he was going to affiliate with the Soviet Union. And of course, you know how we felt about them. They were evil and godless. So this was not okay with us. So our thought was, before he became entrenched, maybe we could overthrow the dude because he's kind of young, kind of inexperienced, probably didn't have a whole lot of backing. However, Cuba was tired of the dang dictators we kept putting in place for them. So they were getting kind of tired of the guys that we put in place for them. So they said, we'll pick our own dictator. And they did end up with a guy that said, you know, we'll have elections when we're ready, and then didn't have them forever. So goodness, I don't know if their dictator was better than ours, but at least he was theirs. So we're going to overthrow him, and we're going to send in the military. We trained 1,400 Cuban revolutionary or Cuban refugees in Nicaragua. The CIA trained them. We were going to drop them off at the beach on the Bay of Pigs. And then we're going to provide some air support so they could get the people in the countryside to join them, go into Havana, overthrow Castro. So Eisenhower makes this plan, doesn't enact it. Kennedy inherits this plan and says, you know what? I think the plan's okay, but that air support makes it look like it's our plan and not an indigenous organic revolution, you know, Cuba's idea. So let's just withdraw the air support. Well, that doesn't go well. So all these folks get dropped off, and 100 folks get killed, 1,100 get captured, I guess 200 or 300 escape, and we rescue them. And it makes Kennedy look, you know, like he doesn't know what he's doing. Plus, we have to make some agreement to ransom them back, and yeah, it doesn't go well for Kennedy. Kennedy's also supposed to have peace talks with JFK because, excuse me, Kennedy is JFK. Kennedy's supposed to have peace talks with Nikita Khrushchev, who's the new premier of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev was the guy who led all the purges for Stalin. And then when Stalin died, he goes, man, Stalin was a terrible dude and he killed a lot of people. We need to be more open about this, except, you know, the fact that Khrushchev led the purges. He might not have mentioned that, but he wanted to end the cult of Stalin. They really did have Stalin statues and banners and stuff everywhere. So they want to get rid of those and try to be a little more open. You know, everything's relative. So Khrushchev was supposed to have peace talks with Eisenhower. And then, you know, he thought Eisenhower's on his way out. He's going to wait and see how the election went. Really didn't want to have talks with Nixon because he'd already had the kitchen debate with him, and that wasn't exactly how Khrushchev had hoped. But he figured Kennedy, kind of a new guy, maybe he'd have a chance with Kennedy. So he says, okay, Kennedy wins, we'll have peace talks with him. But then Kennedy gives a speech at the Brandenburg Gate and says, you know, we're with you, West Berlin. We are all jelly donuts. He says something like Ich ein Berliner, which in some parts of Germany, is some sort of jelly donut, but apparently it wasn't. Who knows? It depends on what your German teacher tells you. But they knew he was talking about how everybody was with him, not that everybody was a jelly donut. But at any rate, he gives the speech and then he pledges to spend something like $1 billion more on defense. And then Khrushchev goes, what the heck's the point of even talking to you then? Cancels the meeting and starts to, yes, build a wall. Yeah, the Berlin Wall. Because I know a bunch of you probably thought the Berlin Wall started after the Berlin blockade and airlift, but no, this is when the Berlin Wall was built after JFK's speech at the Brandenburg Gate and our pledge to spend a whole bunch more on defense. Now, JFK kind of looked weak at the Bay of Pigs. He knows he's got to beef up his reputation. So he's going to get another chance. And this chance will probably be the closest we ever got to thermonuclear war. Yeah, which may not be good. Honestly, probably would have been terrible. But we're going to send a spy plane or two or several over Cuba. And we are going to notice that they are building missile silos. And these would be for those nice intercontinental ballistic missiles, you know, to nuke the crap out of us. And they're in Cuba, which is like 90 miles from parts of Florida. And that's really close. That's, you know, like from here to Waco. We could, it's too close. It's dangerous stuff. So if you're the president, there are lots of things you could do about this. I bet what he did is not what you would do. go on TV and say, hey, we know that they are building nuclear missile sites in Cuba, and they're pointing those nuclear missiles right at Florida. So if they don't take those down, we're going to respond with the full force of the US military. Is that how you would have handled it when you've got on TV and threatened to nuke the Soviet Union? Is that what you would have done? That's probably not how I would have handled it, but I rarely threaten anyone. It really didn't go over well. The Soviet Union responded by saying that's really reckless, and then yeah, me either. That's really reckless, and then sending their nuclear subs toward and their battleships toward Cuba to defend Cuba. So then we went, we can do that too. So and ours don't have as far to go. So we start sending all of our battleships to converge on Cuba, and then Cuba is wondering, Castro's wondering, like, what the heck's about to happen here? Because it's not like anyone talked to him about it. Plus, he's noticing that the Soviet Union seems to be content with nuking the crap out of his country just to prove a point. Because, you know, in this exchange, the country that was going to get destroyed was Cuba. Because that's where the trouble would probably start. Florida probably wasn't super excited about it either. We know they weren't because they did what they do. I don't know. I don't remember this because it's 1962 and I wasn't born until 66. But of course, I've seen pictures and film of it. But what they do is what people in Florida or on the coast do in case of a hurricane. They buy plywood and they put it on their windows. Not sure why. They also go into their nuclear fallout shelters, which I don't know that people have those, or bomb shelters, but you know, getting underground in a hurricane may or may not be a good idea. And they also stock up on green beans and water and whatever you stock up on before you have a crisis. We all know now, before snowpocalypse, we better get some water. You know that, don't we? Yeah, maybe a generator or two. But they stocked up on stuff because somehow those green beans and plywood would save them from nuclear destruction. But so publicly, the United States and the Soviet Union continue threatening each other. Behind the scenes, they start negotiating with each other. We tell the Soviet Union they need to get their missiles out of Cuba. They tell us we need to get our missiles out of Turkey. And we say to them, hey, we don't have any missiles in Turkey. And they say to us, hey, the NATO does. We go like, hey, that's not us, except it is us, and we fund them, and we give them all their weapons, and the United States leads NATO, so it is kind of us with some friends. And they go like, yeah, don't play games with us. And then we end up making a deal with them, which is this. We will take our missiles out of Turkey, but we'll do it privately, and we will never admit that we had missiles in Turkey. They will take their missiles very publicly out of Cuba and promise never to bring them back. We will publicly promise that we will never again try to overthrow the leadership in Cuba. We're okay with that because it makes Kennedy look like he caused Khrushchev to back down. Now, if you're wondering, well, how does this make Khrushchev look in the Soviet Union? How does this make Khrushchev look in the Soviet Union? How does the leader of China look in China right now if he makes a mistake on the global scale? Do people criticize him in China? What do you think? Do you have any thoughts about this? If you lived in China right now, would you be critical of the leadership in China? Yes or no? And okay. So some of you might, because your leader might be weak. Anybody have any thoughts about, there we go. I don't think they allow criticism. I am pretty sure you're right. I had a nephew who I got to see over the weekend at the big festivity, who taught English in China. Yeah, it's very similar to North Korea, only, you know, it's bigger and has a little more money, but their leadership is very similar to North Korea. So if you publicly criticize their government, you're going to jail or one of those fun camps where they re-educate you. Yeah, so in the Soviet Union, same thing during this time period. So Khrushchev doesn't have to worry about how he's going to be viewed in the press or if public opinion will go against him because he led all those purges for Stalin. He knows how to take care of this. So even though he appears to be a more open sort of person, he's really not because he still has that mechanism of his government to control public opinion. So he doesn't have to worry if maybe it looks like he backed down a little because no one's going to know in the Soviet Union. Yeah, it is true. And they didn't even have the internet yet. So, you probably couldn't even sneak in information. Oh, I was going to tell you, my nephew taught English in China, which is a fine way to help get rid of some of your student loan debt. Yeah. And have maybe an interesting experience living in China. Every once in a while, he would post something negative about China on Facebook. It's like, no, cut that out. And I know my brother, when he talked to him, told him that has to stop. And as his time went along, he didn't do that anymore. I just told him don't go hiking on any borders with North Korea. That's the only advice I had. All right. Cuban Missile Crisis, then, the way that it ends is with the behind-the-scenes negotiation. And also, they established a hotline, direct phone line between the Kremlin and the White House. Part of the reason they did this is so that we could threaten each other privately rather than on television. So, we didn't distress the entire country, make everybody buy plywood and green beans, do the stuff that really distressed everybody. So we threaten each other more privately than publicly. And what the Kennedy administration will also do is build up the conventional weapons in our arsenal, so the non-nuclear stuff. So that way we'd have more tanks and guns and ways to directly invade people without nuking them, because, who knows when we might want to invade someone. And he thought that we didn't have enough of those weapons. So you see a military buildup during the Kennedy administration, when you saw Eisenhower sort of scaling down the military. I'm going to remind you of some stuff because I feel like that's what I'm here for. What political party was Eisenhower? Republican or Democrat? The guy that scaled down the military just a bit and said, that maybe nuclear war and war with the in Vietnam was a bad idea. It's that guy that wants to back off the military, who been in charge of the military. Is that a Republican or a Democrat? That is a Republican. The young guy who wants to build up both the nuclear forces and the conventional forces and threatens Khrushchev, is that guy a Republican or a Democrat? That guy's a Democrat, okay? So when I tell you that it's really hard to distinguish between Republicans and Democrats by their foreign policy during this era, at least on the presidential level, I'm telling you the truth. The one guy with the most military experience, and I know I've just told you JFK was a veteran, so was Truman, but Eisenhower's the head of the Allied forces in Europe during World War II, and he's the head of NATO. And he was a general, and he spent his entire life before his presidency in the military. The guy with the absolute most military experience said, we got to back off this thing. The other guy said, nah, I think we should build it up. So I always think that's kind of fascinating. You don't have to think it's fascinating, but I kind of do. All right. So Kennedy is pretty, what's a good word for what he is? I don't know, antagonistic a little. I can't think of the right word that I want to think of. But anyway, he's aggressive. We'll just go with that, with military force. He also is going to send advisors to Vietnam to help the South fight off the forces in the North. We'll send about 20,000 advisors who might be troops as well. Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Or they just needed a lot of advice. All right, behind the scenes negotiated calm storm, direct phone line. Okay, not exactly a thaw in the Cold War. That honestly, as far as we know, there could be all kinds of stuff we don't know. Probably the closest we ever got to nuclear war. Probably. There could be other stuff we don't know about, but as far as we know, that's probably it. More stuff, Kennedy on civil rights. Kennedy's got the problem that all Democrats have during this era, and we've talked about this with Truman, we talked about it with FDR, it's the Southern Democrat leadership, okay? So in the Deep South, the leaders of the Democratic Party also typically are members of some other interesting organizations that tend to wear robes and hoods. So since the KKK controls a lot of politics, they didn't call it the KKK, but they would call it the White Citizens Councils. It's probably a good hint of what's going on there. But since the leadership in the South is at best conservative and is at worst racist, they really don't like the northern, more liberal Democrats who get voted in because of city voters in the north who tend to favor Democrats. So the Democrats, a big party problem is that in the north, they're favored in large cities by immigrants. In the south, they're favored by KKK members. So that's a really bad coalition of folks to get together and try to pick a presidential candidate. But you know, to win, you have to get more votes in the north than the south, because that's where the population was. So they can't pick a southern racist kind of dude as a candidate, but they have to get somebody who is more appealing to southern racist kind of dudes as the vice president. It's why Truman was picked. It's also why LBJ was picked, because he's from the South. He sounds like a little country redneck rancher kind of dude. He's going to say some words that are not even close to politically correct. He's, got some pretty raunchy vocabulary. He's rough, and he sounds, because he's got the drawl and he's from Texas, there are assumptions about his political views toward African Americans that happen to be incorrect. Plus, he's got language that sounds like he's probably racist. And LBJ is a hard dude to figure out, but LBJ and JFK were chosen to appeal to different parts of the political party. Also, fun fact, they really disliked each other. Really, really disliked each other. Yep. So when it says JFK is tentative on civil rights, I wrote that. So, I mean, I'm not Eric Foner, but if you look in Dr. Foner's textbook, you'll notice he's not going to disagree with me because no one does. JFK can't be too aggressive on civil rights because he just won the closest presidential election in US history, by that much. If he loses one southern state, he doesn't get to be president a second time. And what politicians want more than almost anything is re-election. My impression, my cynical thought about politicians, but again, most people agree with me. And you don't have to. So to maintain the Democratic Party coalition, he can't be very aggressive on matters of race. When you start to see a little bit of a change is 1963, after the brutality in Birmingham and the letter from the Birmingham jail, so the summer of 63. And a lot of times I'll have students say, well, he really couldn't be pro-civil rights because he just didn't have time. Well, he had time for the Cuban Missile Crisis. He had time for the Bay of Pigs. He had time to, increase military spending. He had time to send advisors to Vietnam. He was in year 3 of his term, 61, 62, 63. This is, he only had 1 year left. So he didn't have time to make those decisions. I'm going to go with a big no on that. He didn't do it because he didn't want to upset the southern part of the Democratic Party coalition. And he's not alone in that. I mean, no one had wanted to do that before. So I'm not being, I'm not saying, well, JFK is different than the rest of the Democrats. He's the same. So, and I'm also not saying the Republicans are super holy in this either. The Republicans have a different coalition that may not be as racist in this era, but it's just about to be. So they're going to do some stuff that you'll look at and go like, that's kind of sketchy. But the Democrats are doing the sketchy stuff as well. They're just doing different sketchy stuff at different times. So after Dr. King gets arrested, he's going to change his mind a bit. and he calls for the end to racial discrimination and says this is no longer a Black problem, this is no longer a white problem, this is a human problem, and it's time as Americans that we solve it. This really happens. If you're looking for an event besides Martin Luther King's arrest, it's the assassination of Medgar Evers, who's the leader of the NAACP in Mississippi. And they're leading a voting rights campaign, voter registration campaign in Mississippi. And some crazy KKK member just shoots him in his driveway in front of his wife and kids. And that's where he dies. It's super tragic stuff. And that's really the event or occasion that I think the day after that is when JFK gives the speech. So he calls for an end to racial discrimination and then is assassinated a few months later. I don't think there's a lot of evidence that that is why he got assassinated. The guy that, the guy that assassinated him had spent a lot of time in the Soviet Union, had been, I think he was a marksman in the Marines, but, and also is probably, anytime somebody assassinates someone, we always say they were clearly unstable, which I suppose is partly true because most of us don't think killing each other is a really good way to solve a problem. I don't think we think that, but I don't know. All right. Lee Harvey Oswald, name, I forgot to say the name, sorry. All right, so when JFK is killed by Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas, and he was coming to Austin for a fundraiser, and he had kind of been warned not to come, but he came anyway. He was with the Texas governor who also gets shot, and he gets paralyzed as a result. JFK lives long enough to go to the hospital, but that's about it. He got, yeah, they rode an open convertible, which doesn't really happen anymore. And I know too, some of you go like, aren't there some conspiracies about the assassination? Heck yeah, there's a bunch of those. I have no earthly idea if any of those things are true. Okay, well, LBJ becomes the president, and he's as not JFK as he can be. He is not polished or smooth in any way. I'm sure his wife's attractive. I'm not saying that she isn't, but he went to a very fine university, yes, a place that I got a degree from. For him, it was Texas Normal School. And when I went there, it was called Southwest Texas State. If you were fortunate enough to get in, you could also go to Texas State University. And all my little friends who went to UT that made fun of me, I would just tell them which president went to UT. Haha, okay. But LBJ is about as country sounding as anyone you'd ever meet. Oh yeah, I don't want to talk about, yeah, assassination. No, that's a lot. Yeah. Yeah, anybody who wants gross information like that can always find it online. Yeah. I kind of think 8th grade history teachers are a little notorious about that because I think they think it's interesting to 8th grade kids and that the goriness gets your attention. I really don't know, but, and there's so much stuff we really don't know. They had a commission about it and have investigated a lot of times, but it's, you know, because the guy who assassinated him then got killed by a mafia, kind of loosely associated to the mafia kind of guy. We really don't know. And the Kennedy family did have some dealings with the mafia, not JFK, I'm not suggesting that, but a generation passed, and it's part of how their family earned their money during Prohibition. So, you know, there's some sketchy things going on in the Kennedy family, also some super noble things, but yeah, okay. So LBJ takes over, and LBJ is not polished. He went to a state college. He really thought JFK was super spoiled and, you know, had kind of this paternalistic thing going on where his life was easy, silver spoon kind of thing. Although apparently he was friendly with Mrs. Kennedy, and I don't mean that in an untoward way. He was told her, you know, after he died that she should take as long as she needed to move out of the White House. He didn't need to be in there if there's anything he could help. checked in with her after she left. I think that he really had a genuine, appropriate affection for her and was trying to be as helpful as he could. But one of the interesting things to me about LBJ is no matter how rough his appearance was and how much he seemed like a cranky old, potentially racist ranch hand with really terrible language. And if you've seen Forrest Gump, I don't know if people in your generation see that. There's a scene in Forrest Gump where Forrest Gump goes to the White House and he meets LBJ, and it's after Forrest Gump got shot in the buttocks. Yes, that's what happened. And so LBJ asked him if he can see where he got shot. So he moons the president. And I know when my students would talk about that, they go, oh, that's so funny. Forrest Gump mooned the president. The reason, okay, everyone, okay, that's true. You're probably right. The reason that they put that scene in the movie, and I would tell my students, I watched Forrest Gump once and it wasn't really my thing, but because then I had all these students that think Forrest Gump is real and that all those events are completely accurate, but of course they're not. But the reason they put that scene, and it's a good movie, the reason they put that scene in there is when LBJ was president, he had some really rough thing happen to his gallbladder. It had to be removed immediately. He had an infection, apparently could have been fatal. It was pretty serious stuff. So a week or two after he gets an operation, that sort of stuff, the press asks him how he's doing, and he just lifts up his shirt and shows them the incision. So the reason that they put the thing with Forrest Gump, showing him his wounds, mooning the president, isn't just because it's funny that somebody would moon the president, it's because it's the kind of thing that LBJ clearly would have done because he kind of did that with the gallbladder surgery. You're going like, that's not nearly as funny as Forrest Gump mooning the president. I know, I apologize, but I just felt like I had to tell you. But LBJ is kind of rough. He's not polished at all. He's not, he didn't go to Harvard. He didn't go to Georgetown. He went to Texas State, which is a fine place to go. Also, when he was in Texas, he, as a teacher, which I appreciate, and a public school teacher, not a college professor, public school teacher, he taught in border schools with Mexican American kids in segregated schools because he thought segregation was wrong, and he thought that segregated kids should have certified teachers, or I don't know, certified, but degreed teachers who went to college, that sort of thing. So he served in that way. He also brought electricity to my part of Texas. Through Leander, he helped create the Pedernales Electric Cooperative as part of the Tennessee Valley Authority, as part of the New Deal. So he had a super long history in Congress. He had been in the Senate for over 30 years, and very much like your current president, really understood how the Senate worked and how to get things passed through the Senate. So LBJ is going to pass an amazing number of bills without very much difficulty at all, in a way that kind of rivaled FDR. And I know some people kind of wonder, is Biden going to do the same thing? Although it looks like he's more likely, just from recent month or so, to use executive order. But anyway, LBJ is going to be really skilled at getting legislation through Congress. He's going to use the legacy of JFK to kind of do that. He'll say, like, let's do this for JFK. Let's honor his legacy, even though they really didn't like each other at all. And he's going to be pretty profoundly in favor of improving civil rights and ending poverty. But he also wants to end communism at the same time. So he's going to be the guy that makes sure 500,000 US soldiers end up in Vietnam. This is going to be an enormous problem for his legacy. Enormous problem for his legacy. So one of the very first things that gets passed through Congress because of JFK's legacy and LBJ's work really, is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination based on sex or race in hiring. And then you had Freedom Summer when, so Civil Rights Act is early 64, and then Freedom Summer is a whole bunch of voter registration drives in the South, in case you're wondering what is Freedom Summer. And lots of kids, college kids from the north and college kids from the south too, work on these voting rights drives. 64 election highlights racial division in the Democrats with the rise of conservatism in the Republican Party because Barry Goldwater is nominated, and the nomination speech, A Time for Choosing, which is pretty famous in its era, is given by Ronald Reagan. But Barry Goldwater, Barry Goldwater, you've got to watch this living room candidate thing. I don't know if I can show it to you. I may try, and then you can tell me how it works. I never have success at this, but maybe today is the day. We'll hope for it, okay? But Barry Goldwater, because we had already entered with advisors in Vietnam, Barry Goldwater says, you know what? We could really end this war quickly in Vietnam if we used nuclear weapons. Tell me he's wrong. Most people thought that was crazy. So LBJ is going to make the first really effective negative political campaign, commercial, excuse me. And if I have any luck, I'll show it to you here in a minute. And it really is, it's the big part of the reason that Barry Goldwater doesn't win. The Democrats, I mentioned that there's division within the Democrats. The division within the Democrats is the Deep South, who really wants to return to segregation and doesn't like the progressive civil rights policies of LBJ. They think he's too liberal. So they run a guy who says slogan is segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And he wins several states in the South. Texas is not one of them. And in California is disputing a federal law that says, they've passed a state law that contradicts this federal law that says that you can't discriminate against people by race or sex when you try to sell them a house. If you've been paying attention to politics lately, you may or may not have noticed that there's a very large infrastructure bill upcoming. You know, we're either going to vote it yes or no, and they're talking about it. But the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, I think that's how you say his name, says that the interstate highway system was racist. I don't know if the interstate highway system is racist because, you know, it's roads and it was built for defense purpose and that kind of stuff. But his point really is that in most cities that the interstate goes through, on one side of the interstate and the other side of the interstate, there's usually some version of segregation. It's either racial segregation, or you have industrial side on one side, which is where most of the Black housing is, and storefronts and nicer homes on the other side, which tends to be the white side of town. And if you go through Austin, that was true in Austin. West Austin developed differently than East Austin, and it was the line of segregation. And real estate agents wouldn't show people houses in the wrong part of town. There wasn't a law that said that. It was a tradition that really wasn't broken until the 60s and 70s. And California is trying to pass a law that allows them to continue that tradition, which should tell you something about California politics during that time period. And remember that Richard Nixon was from California, as was Ronald Reagan. So their politics are different during this time period. But I'm going to try to show you the living room candidate ad if I have any luck. And then next time we'll talk about all the Vietnam stuff and all these laws and stuff. We'll get through it, I promise. And then we'll talk about how that relates to your weekly question. All right, let me see. And you guys have to tell me if you can see what shows up there. All right, do you guys see the picture of LBJ and his wife? Or no? Somebody else tell me. Okay, I'm looking in the chat. All right, let me try something else. Dang it, Serna. Okay. Are you guys telling me how to do it? Because that would be cool if you had advice. It's like, yeah, I know you guys probably don't know. You're not on my end of the. Okay, let's try this. All right, now do you see it? I'm looking in the chat. Hey, all right. You may or may not be able to hear it, but seeing it will be enough. This is, and I know I'm about to get the 3-minute warning, but the commercial doesn't last that long. It doesn't last 4 minutes and 11 seconds. It's a different one. This is one of my all-time favorite websites. So you should go there because it's my favorite. But it has all the election years and it shows you the campaign commercials from the different time period. Like if you go to 52, they're all like happy and they have cartoons and stuff. But this is the first truly negative campaign ad and it's amazingly successful. So, and it shows you Democrat and Republican. We're going to pick something called the Daisy ad. And even if you can't hear it, which could happen, you'll get the idea. I know she can't count, by the way. Uh-oh, I think I left the sound going. That's pretty rough, isn't it? But I mean, for the first negative campaign ad, they went all the way, didn't they? But they really wanted to show you that the other guy was way out of control and he was going to end humanity as we knew it. Plus, you know, we must either love each other or we must die. So, and that voice at the end, that was LBJ. So I don't know if you heard it or recognized it, but I'm telling you, man, that was oh, I'm sorry that the audio didn't work. But if you, that's like 30 seconds worth of something. I would definitely watch that as you leave class. And I apologize that, yes, yes, it was bad. I think it was, but desperation, but it was effective. And I think because it was such a new tactic, I mean, now we expect all the ads will be extreme and negative, that sort of stuff. There is a reason they started with the little kid, the little cute kid. Yeah, that's who we were going to kill. If we elected that other guy, he was going to kill your kids. Yeah, yeah. You don't want your kids killed, do you? No, I know it. It's pretty rough. It is, and it was supposed to be. All right, that's a lovely way to end class, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. I'm sure you appreciate that. Before we go, let me double check on the on the roll. You guys can go watch that nice video. Yeah, if you like. But I do love that website because I'm just weird and geeky like.